You're listening to the Fertility Docs Uncensored podcast, featuring insight on all things fertility from some of the top-rated doctors around America. Whether you're struggling to conceive or just planning for your future family, we're here to guide you every step of the way.
Hi, everyone. We're back with another episode of Fertility Docs Uncensored. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Abby Eblen from Nashville Fertility Center, and today I'm joined by my co-host and friends, Dr. Susan Hudson from Texas Fertility Center.
Good morning.
And Dr. Carrie Bedient from the Fertility Center of Las Vegas.
Hi.
Hey, guys. So how have you been doing? It's been a few weeks since we've recorded episodes, and we were just kind of catching up with each other a minute ago. And Susan, you mentioned that you just took a test this week. Tell us a little bit about that.
I just took my accounting midterm.
Yeah.
So even at our age, we still go to school, huh? So you're still taking tests.
Yes, I'm still taking tests. It's I'm working on my MBA, and I'm just kind of chipping away at it. I don't take classes all the time. I kind of will take a class and then I'll take a break and then I'll take a class, and they're all 7-week classes. So, I'm like, I can survive anything for 7 weeks.
Yeah.
And so I'm taking an accounting class, and it is very enlightening in how I've made it this far, not understanding some basic tenets of accounting, and, with us being, part of Ovulation and that type of thing, and being like, oh, this is what they're talking about, and different things like this, that I really think that more people who are, I don't know, as somebody who previously ran my own business and didn't have this knowledge base, I wish I would have done this years ago, but hindsight's 2020, and all I can do is move forward. But it's very enlightening. It's like, it's an amazing amount of knowledge, and it's a lot like medicine and fertility. It's a whole bunch of acronyms.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother language.
It's a language into itself. Yeah.
All these specialties have their own language, and we know that, speaking medicalese is a whole other language, and legalese is a whole other language, but you kind of forget that everybody else has their own language too. And the accountants they're into the acronyms, man.
Oh yeah.
Even in science, because I've been out of science for a while, and I was just mentioning a couple of years ago, I got a master's degree in clinical and translational research. So sounds very involved, but a lot of my medical knowledge, unlike in accounting for you, Susan, a lot of my medical knowledge was really helpful, but it's amazing how different things in the field have changed. And I took this bioinformatics class, and it was so cool and so interesting to figure out, like, for example, when we talk about the COVID variants, how people figure that out. They're able to sequence the DNA, and then there's these banks of just different genes, and you can look in and see how they match up, and you can figure out how they've evolved over time because of that. And these are like available just on the general web for general people. And it's just interesting how the field has evolved so much over time. But like you, it's really difficult to do all the things that we do during the day with our regular job, go home to our families. And then after that, you've got homework and projects.
Absolutely. But like I said, anybody can do anything for 7 weeks. And I'm like, I'm remotivated to working on getting this completed. And it's going to take some time, but as long as it's not it doesn't interfere too much, I'm game with it.
Yeah. And I think we as women kind of underestimate how capable we are to do so many different things. And I think, the negative impact of that is we probably wear ourselves out trying to take care of our job and our husbands, and if we have families, and also trying to do other things, at home. It's like, makes you appreciate when you're 18, you could just go to college and just focus on school, and that was it.
I love TED Talks, and one of my favorite TED Talks of all time was essentially this woman talking about how in your life, you can make time for whatever you think is important. Okay. And it's an amazing TED Talk. And they essentially took this woman who's this high-powered executive and said, I need you to carve 10 or 15 hours out of your week. And it was like, absolutely not. There's no way. Well, if you add like an emergency, like a pipe blows in your house and a wall has to come down, how amazingly you can, with whatever priorities, and so it's funny because ever since I listened to that, I really hate it when people are like, I don't have time for something. And I'm like,
exercise.
Exactly. It's not that you don't have time. I don't want to give my time for that.
Yes.
That is so much more true. And it's true, and whatever you want to make your priority. I mean, I think about my days when I was in college and how I felt like I was so busy and I had so little to get done.
I know. What are your thoughts, Carrie?
Agree with all the above. I have just started to really recommit to exercising and taking better care of myself, which takes a crap ton of time, which is part of the reason why I hadn't done it before. But it's really amazing. I set the alarm for a little bit earlier every morning, get it to go, and you just do it. And I am both grateful and envious. Grateful that I am not in any extra classes right now, but envious because I kind of want to be. I just haven't figured out how to do it because I'm a course director for the med school, plus one residency in town, plus another residency in town. Like there's only so many hours in a day, and so it's trying to balance what you want to do, what you have to do, what you should be doing, and figuring out, okay, where's the sweet spot of how do all the important factors and what's going to be a priority at any given time. There's I think it was a tweet that went around. I'm not on Twitter, so I don't know, but it's this woman who is talking about juggling glass balls, and some balls are glass and some balls are plastic. And you have to know at any given time which ones you can drop and they're plastic, so they're going to bounce, versus which ones are going to shatter. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just like a general ball of work and a general ball of spouse and a general ball of kids and family and health and all of that. It's like specific balls of your kid's recital, your marriage anniversary, this very specific work project. And so she talks about knowing what you can drop and what you can let go, and it's going to be okay when it bounces. Yeah. And so I try and remember that so that I get it all right.
That's a good visual. That's a very good visual.
That's a great visual. Yeah. Well, on that note, since that's such a great analogy, we're going to move on to the question of the day. So Carrie, do you have the question of the day for us?
I do. And here we go. So patient said, I recently switched from my OBGYN to an RE. My OBGYN diagnosed me with endometriosis, removed a septum, and scheduled an HSG, which was normal. Okay. The RE has done an ultrasound and 2 postcoital tests, both with low sperm counts. He scheduled us for IUI this month, and I'm concerned he hasn't done enough testing. He explained the benefits of the postcoital test and gave me a printout, but is this really enough to move to IUI, and is there additional testing I should request? So there's a lot going on in that.
A lot of questions in there.
Can we break that down?
So she already has a diagnosis of endometriosis. She's had a uterine septum, so that
uterine issue,
and she has her tubes that are open. So that information that her OBGYN gave her is quite a lot right there. Endo has huge impacts in fertility. Knowing the tubes are open is really important. Knowing the septum is gone, really important. Okay. So she mentions an ultrasound done and postcoital tests. And she doesn't mention any other testing, although elsewhere in the question, she did reference that there was an ultrasound done and that the RE said your egg reserve is normal. So really she wants to know, should she do additional testing? And I'm curious from both of you, when was the last time you ordered a postcoital test?
I can say I have never ordered a postcoital test in my entire career.
I ordered it early on, more than 20 years ago, right after my fellowship. And then sort of, I think as a general rule, most people kind of felt like it really was not that helpful. Because the funny thing was, a lot of times back then, you'd start talking to patients about how their postcoital test was abnormal, and in the same month they'd be pregnant. So it was pretty clear, even without a lot of randomized testing, that probably was not the best determinant of how likely the sperm was to penetrate cervical mucus and get to the egg. So pretty much about 20 years ago, most people stopped doing it as a standard test.
Abby, I have never ordered one either. Can you tell us how you instruct people to do that?
Okay, you guys are making me feel really, really old right now. So basically, near as I remember, you would have somebody do an ovulation predictor kit because, right around the time of your period, right around the time of ovulation, your cervical mucus gets thin and stretchy, that's sometimes you can sort of, that's a natural way of kind of checking.
The egg white.
Yeah. And so at that time you would have sex, and I think you'd have to come in within, I don't know, I can't remember the time frame, maybe within a couple hours or so. And basically you'd bring the patient back. You would basically take a sampling of that mucus in the cervix. So you could use like an angiocatheter, a little catheter, and suck up some of that mucus and then put it on a slide. And then you would count and see how many sperm you saw. And based on that number, you would decide if the sperm could actually swim through the mucus or not. So
did you want a lot or not a lot?
You wanted a lot, because if you got it from the mucus, it told you that the sperm was getting up in the mucus and getting through it. I mean, you couldn't actually go in the uterine cavity and know how many sperm were there. But if they're getting up in the cervical mucus, you're thinking, okay, they're able to get through that. So that was the test. Wasn't a very good test.
As a field, reproductive endocrinologists we ask a lot of our patients, and infertility ruins a lot of sex lives. But I feel like that test really puts
a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it's like, do the OPK, know that you're ready, have sex, and then be in the office within an hour.
Yes, absolutely. That was always the challenge.
I cannot imagine thinking that having the promise of a pelvic exam within an hour of having sex.
It doesn't make for like a very intimate atmosphere.
No, it really doesn't.
No. Okay, so is there additional testing that this patient should have? So we know her tubes are good. We know that uterus has been evaluated. We know that there's a note of low sperm counts. I would be interested to see if just a garden variety semen analysis has been done.
Right, at least a semen analysis.
Yeah.
I also think, ultrasound is going to give you an idea of antral follicle count, but I personally like to get some
AMH
chemistries, get an AMH, get an FSH and estradiol, really have more evaluation, on how the ovaries are working, especially with that history of endometriosis. I like to have a better idea of what's going on there. So I think there are some missing things. Not that IUI is going to be a wrong decision with what we know, but it may not actually be enough treatment based on what we know and what we don't know. So
one thing I would say too is I think it continually amazes patients at how few tests we really have. And over time, postcoital tests included, a lot of tests that we used to do, sperm penetration assay, postcoital tests, have kind of fallen by the wayside. Mm-hmm. It seems like we have less tests rather than more. And if you think back, even if you took one anatomy class in your whole life, if you think back to the things even you intuitively know that have to happen for an egg and a sperm to get together, they have to have receptors. The receptors have to bind together. They have to, within 24 hours, the DNA in the cell has to decompress and then do its little dance and then start dividing. I mean, all those things have regulatory steps, I'm sure, that control those. We just don't have tests for any of that stuff. So there's so many things we don't have tests for. But unfortunately, those tests don't exist at this point. So we do very little testing, I would agree with the patient, compared to what could be done. But unfortunately, the state of the art is not there yet.
All right. So what are we talking about today, Abby?
So we are talking about or at least our title is, what are some advantages of genetic testing? And by that, we're talking both on partners and also on embryos. So Carrie, why don't you start out and kind of talk a little bit about genetic testing? Why would we do it, and who do we do it on, and when do we do it?
Sure. So genetic testing, that's really a broad term. And it's important to know when we're referring to genetic testing, what that is in reference to. So the basic biology behind it is that every human being has 46 chromosomes in every single cell. And kind of in a perfect world, they are all the same chromosomes. Now, there are some conditions where there's some variation there and difference in expression. We're not going to get into those variations today. So in general, every cell and every human and every body has 46 chromosomes. And when you're talking about reproduction, those chromosomes separate out, and half are coming from the egg and the other half are coming from the sperm. And so a chromosome and a gene are two closely related but different things. So a chromosome is a huge collection of genes. So on one chromosome, you're going to have hundreds to thousands of genes. A gene is something that it's a building block. And sometimes single genes can be very, very powerful. And if one little thing is off with them, you then upset the whole apple cart.
It's kind of like a computer program.
I was thinking even more simplistic because my brain does not work on computer program levels. My brain works on, I'm thinking about a cinder block wall. The chromosome is the compilation of all the cinder blocks put together, one sturdy wall, whereas a gene would be one individual brick within there.
Okay. And I just, for the heck of it, I'll throw my analogy is a gene is a book. I mean, a chromosome is a book and a gene is a paragraph in the book. It's just one small part of the book, but all the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
If it's the paragraph in the book where they're revealing the murderer, that paragraph gets cut out, big problems happen because you got to know who the murderer in the story was.
That's right.
If it's a paragraph that's just describing the trees outside the house that, 6 houses down from the murderer, where the murder happened, you can tell what kind of stories I like. That's less relevant if something gets damaged in it. And so when we're talking about genetic testing, we're talking about all the ways that we can look at chromosomes or at genes and how that impacts the health of the couple going through, how that impacts our ability to do treatment, and how that impacts the ultimate outcome of a healthy, live human being.
So, Carrie, if we're going to test somebody to see if they carry some abnormal gene, do we just test the embryo for all those, or how do we do that? Who do we start testing first when we're looking for genes?
So I had a patient who was just asking this question recently, actually, and she was like, I don't really want to get the testing done. Why don't we just test the embryo alone? And this was in reference to all those specific little genes. And so we had a good conversation about how testing all of these little genes takes a decent amount of genetic material. And so it is better to test the providers of egg and sperm, mom and dad, or donors, however it's coming together, and test them because they are full-grown adults. They've got plenty to spare. You take one little, 5, 10 cc tube of blood, and you can get a ton of information because 5 to 10 cc's of blood
or saliva, cheek swab, that holds a ton of material to work with. And so as a result, when we're looking at specific genes, because we tend to be doing a real scattershot approach to it, we want to test appearance. And that is different than testing an embryo because an embryo is a compilation of usually about 1 to 300 cells, more or less, in total. And so we take out 4 to 5 of those cells when we're looking at an embryo. And that is a vastly different, smaller number than what we can get from an adult who's going through. So when we're looking at genes, we're testing the parents, not the embryo itself.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. To summarize, that's what we're doing. We're testing parents first. And so, Susan, sometimes when I talk to couples and the tests that we do, the general term is called an expanded carrier screening test. It just, like you said, it's like a shotgun approach. We test everybody, regardless of race or ethnicity, for all these crazy genes they could carry. And, we find out from Ancestry.com, we don't really know our family history, probably more than 2 or 3 generations back. So it's really hard for even an individual person to go, oh, okay, you need to test me for this or this. But Susan, speak to the point that patients make sometimes when I talk to them about this test. They're like, oh, well, nobody in my family has it. Everybody's healthy that I know of. So what do you tell them when they say that?
So the way I describe these tests are the entire purpose of these tests are to find things that are hiding in the family tree until the right person meets the right person. And so just because you don't have a history, besides the fact that most of us, beyond our grandparents, we really don't know what were their medical ailments and things like that. And even among that, if you had somebody who, when we're talking about grandparents or great grandparents, we had lots of, childhood deaths. We had lots of infant deaths for lots of different reasons. Mm-hmm. And most of the genes that we're testing for are for big, bad, and uglies. Okay. They're not for mild diseases. They're diseases that are potentially going to have a significant life-altering event happen to this child.
Death at an early age, for example, or stillborn. Exactly.
And so just because you don't have a family history of these things, that's why we need to check. And there's so much unknown in your family history. Was somebody actually not the parent of so-and-so, these things happen. I mean, Carrie has a great statistic. What is it? 15%?
15% non-paternity. That means 15% of people are walking around with the milkman as daddy and they don't know.
Wow. I didn't know that statistic.
That's high.
Women have taken care of their own fertility for a long time. Like male factor infertility, women will take care of that.
Interesting.
So, I mean, it's one of those things that it's important for us to understand that just because there's not a family history, that doesn't mean that it's not important. And sometimes, we even have people who say, well, because they think we're doing testing, that means we have to medically act on that. And that's not necessarily the case. First of all, I think there is power in knowledge. Okay. And when we do this testing, the first thing that comes up is if both parents are a carrier for the same condition and they potentially might want to prevent that condition, that they could potentially use IVF or in vitro fertilization, and we can test embryos and then transfer embryos that we know should not be affected by that particular gene. Okay. But for those people who might say, that's not the way we want to roll the dice, we would rather just, try on our own, or we don't want to do testing or things like this. I think it's where you gain your power is that, if I know I'm carrying a child that has a 25% chance of having this major illness, I might make a different decision on which hospital to deliver. Who's going to be my pediatrician? What other types of doctors might my child need? If childcare, to me, I mean, childcare is one of the biggest things is, if I have a 25% chance of having a child with some very special and specific needs, I might need to choose this type of childcare over another type of childcare or, support systems. There's so many other things that are real life that can play into having that information.
And one other thing too, I think that is pointed out a lot of times is that when you have a child that has a problem, the child is born and maybe the first few months, you don't know that something bad is happening. And then all of a sudden the child stops meeting its benchmarks. And then all of a sudden there's really maybe nothing specific and you can't figure out what's going on. On average, it takes people about 6 years, and they call it a medical odyssey, where they go to a lot of subspecialists to try and figure out what's going on with their child before they can even start to get help. And so to your point, Susan, if you can find out early on, even if you choose not to do genetic testing and just roll the dice and see what happens, the other benefit is, early on, like you said, and not only can you pick your providers and who are going to take care of your children, but you can also hopefully get treatment early that may have an impact on the overall health of the child.
And a lot of these diseases we're testing are metabolic disorders.
What does metabolic mean?
Metabolic disorders are disorders where your body's not processing something correctly. And if you know ahead of time that your child's not going to process something correctly, there might be very safe interventions that you can do that might help prevent harm to your child. Whereas if you just kind of kept on living normal life, exposing your child to these, whatever that substance may be, that we might actually cause damage that you could have prevented if you had that knowledge ahead of time.
So Carrie, what do you say to couples who say, well, okay, I'm going to do IVF and I'm going to do some genetic testing. What are we usually talking about when we talk about genetic testing in regards to IVF, and how does that relate to what Susan just talked about with genetic testing with genes?
So this is where we start getting into a little bit of alphabet soup. The current official name of the testing we do is called PGT-A. PGT-A. In the past, it has been known as PGS, PGD,
CCS, comprehensive chromosome screening.
Yes. I feel like there's one more that I'm missing in there, but those are the...
Fish was thrown in there at some point too, but...
Yeah, there's fish. But PGT-A is the current correct term that refers to the majority of testing that we're doing. And what that stands for is preimplantation, i.e. before we actually get you knocked up, genetic testing. And the A refers to aneuploid. And what aneuploidy is, the ploidy of a cell is referring to whether they have the correct number of chromosomes present. So euploid means there's the correct number. Aneuploid means that there's the incorrect number. And the human body is really good about saying, do not pass go, do not collect $200 when you have an aneuploid embryo. Sometimes that's a really early process where the embryo doesn't grow. Sometimes it doesn't implant. Sometimes it's an early miscarriage. Sometimes it's a late miscarriage. And sometimes it's an affected child. But what we are typically trying to do is avoid many of those issues in our patients, because what's really important to know is that going through an embryo transfer is not a totally benign event. And what I mean by that is that there's money that's being spent. There's
emotional energy.
There's emotional energy. There's physical energy. There's lots of hopes and dreams. Going through a miscarriage, while the physical part of it tends to be just fine, the emotional part of it is brutal. And so what we are looking to do is avoid some of the health consequences, avoid some of the emotional consequences of transferring an embryo that is not destined to make it.
So, Carrie, how often do we see aneuploid or genetically abnormal embryos? Is that a very common thing?
Extraordinarily common, as in an everyday kind of event thing. And in many respects, in an every patient kind of event thing. We, just to reference back to some of the episodes where we talked with Amy Jones, who's just a phenomenal scientist, when she was giving us some of the data is, all right, what percentage of embryos that we get are we likely to see abnormal? It's all dependent on age, where younger tends to have higher percentages of normal, and patients who have more years, typically greater than 36, 37 years, have a higher percentage of abnormal embryos.
But under the best of circumstances, we're talking about a 50-50 split.
50-50, yeah. The most successful patient, youngest patient.
Yeah. Well, and it's not necessarily actually that youngest patient. So remember, you actually have that little bit higher percentage when you're in your young 20s as compared to when you're in your mid to late 20s. So there's that little spike too.
It's true.
But it's common is the point. At least half of your embryos are probably going to be genetically abnormal if you're an average person going through IVF.
And most people don't realize that when you're trying to conceive just on your own, making a baby in the bedroom, that there is a huge percentage, upwards of 50%, where you just never realize you're pregnant because everything has started to happen. And then the body has said, oops, not normal, game over. And you get a period, and maybe it's a day or two late, but you don't ever really notice that because it's just within the realm of normal. And there's no way for us to test for it unless you're doing really fancy mouse studies and that are hard to come by.
So Susan, can you talk about how the gene, like say somebody tests positive for something like cystic fibrosis, how does that work when they're doing IVF? Can you also test for the right number of chromosomes and also test for that gene? How does that work?
So very good question. So as Carrie mentioned, the PGT-A, A for aneuploidy, abnormal number of chromosomes, tests for the chromosomal abnormalities. There's also a segment of testing called PGT-M, okay? And the M part is where we're testing for these specific mutations, okay? That's what M is for. And we're looking for those abnormal genes that we know are present in both parents or both sources of egg and sperm. Now, an important difference to know about PGT-M is this is not an off-the-shelf test. And what I mean by that is, say I'm going to get ready for IVF. I'm like, woohoo, we want to do PGT-A. That is not going to take any additional time or testing or anything that's going to kind of change the scope of what I was generally going to plan. Okay. PGT-M is very specific to the individual sources of egg and sperm. Okay. And so what happens is if you say, me and my partner, we're both carriers for cystic fibrosis. We want to test our embryos to see if they would be affected or be carriers or not have any genetic, link to cystic fibrosis. You have to, one, be accepted into a program because not all programs are going to accept all disease states. Okay. Number one. Number two, they have to form a probe and create this little kind of device that's going to look at your embryo specific, that's going to be based on each of your specific
abnormalities.
Exactly. And so it generally takes about 4 to 6 weeks for that type of probe to be created. Okay. Sometimes even maybe a little bit longer. And another thing to add is because they're making this so specifically, they may ask for blood or saliva samples from other first-degree relatives of yours. Okay. And this sometimes kind of hits people like a brick wall when we start talking about it, because they may not have shared their fertility journey with their family members. And then we're sitting there going, hey, can we get blood from your mom, your dad, your sibling, that type of thing. And so that's something to kind of not be surprised about, because that by having those multiple sources of blood, they're able to get the best probe created. Now, generally, when it comes to the actual testing, there's still, at the time of PGTA or PGTM, we're looking at embryos that are expanded blastocysts. These are advanced stage embryos where we can tell what part's going to become the baby and what part's going to become the placenta. We sample a few of the cells that are going to become the placenta, cryopreserve these embryos, and then send those cells off to the lab to have them tested for either the chromosome and or gene abnormality. Generally, what happens is they test the chromosomes first, and the embryos that are chromosomally normal are then tested for the gene abnormality. Now, when you have those gene abnormality tests, you can find out if they have 2 abnormal copies, 1 abnormal copy, or no abnormal copies. And generally speaking, the ones with no or 1 abnormal copy are ones that you would preferentially transfer, because you shouldn't have that specific disease state under most circumstances.
One other thing I wanted to interject when you were talking about, having to bring family members in to figure this out. Some people, and even I, before I knew a whole lot about genetics, and I've learned more in the last 5 years about genetics than I've probably known in my whole career. But a gene, for example, like cystic fibrosis, my understanding is, if you think of the analogy of a book, a gene for cystic fibrosis could be like a deletion of a whole chapter. It could be deletion of like a couple of pages in the book. It could be deletion of just a small, tiny word in a paragraph. And so deletions, additions of pieces of information, or point mutations could all result, have the same end result. And so, I've had a couple of patients that have had 23andMe done, and they're like, oh, well, I tested negative for cystic fibrosis. Well, that may be the case, but it may be that it wasn't a very
comprehensive.
Yeah, it may have tested for one, because there's a mutation called Delta F508, which is the most common cystic fibrosis mutation. But many people who still have cystic fibrosis don't have that specific mutation. So that's why sometimes we have to bring family members in to really make sure that the probe that we're developing is really one that's correct for you and for your partner, basically.
So when you guys get someone who is considering doing PGTA on their embryos, how do you counsel them? Like when they say, okay, is this going to make my IVF more effective? What do you tell them about what the test tells us? Does it make it more effective? Do you tell them other things? How do you phrase that? What do you tell patients?
So one thing that I talk to patients about is that it helps us get to that normal embryo, which ideally is going to help you get to your pregnancy faster. Okay. So if you have 10 embryos, and I know sitting here, I'm playing Russian roulette with 5 of them. Okay. That if I can sit there and transfer a single embryo and give you 60 to 70% chance of taking home a baby, that is potentially going to save you money and time in the long term. To me, that's a major advantage to the PGT testing.
And I think it's also advantageous. There's a lot of different groups it's advantageous for. I think it was sort of initially targeted at women that were older, and it's still in that group. It's really helpful because I think in the last few years, all of us can say we've had several patients beyond the age of 40 that have had a great outcome in a successful pregnancy because they may have only had 1 or 2 good or just a few embryos, but we were lucky enough to find one that was genetically normal amongst all those other ones or those few other ones. And if you transfer that embryo, and we see this time and time again in our statistics, if you can find an embryo that's genetically normal, regardless of the patient's age, overwhelmingly, those patients have on the order of 65 to 70% pregnancy rate. Now, I will say in a lot of our older patients, the biggest disadvantage or the thing that's the most difficult or the biggest challenge for them is a lot of times we can't stimulate them well enough to sometimes even to make it where we can get an egg and go to egg retrieval. But if we can find some eggs at the time of egg retrieval, if we were able to have good fertilization and the embryos are able to grow to that 5th day, again, if we can test an embryo and find a normal one, they have a great chance of pregnancy.
And I think it's important. I think we've kind of, or at least a lot of us have made a transition that my goal is to get you a pregnancy, not get you a transfer.
Correct. Yeah.
And transferring an embryo that isn't going to result in pregnancy, that's hard. I mean, fertility treatment is hard work. I mean, it is not only financially exhausting, but it's emotionally and physically exhausting. And having to go through that process, more than once. I had a patient once who was in her mid 40s and she had kind of polycystic ovaries. We did 2 egg retrievals. Each time she ended up with almost, and this is way above what you would normally expect.
That's what I was just going to say. We don't normally see that.
This is not what we normally see. And she ended up having like somewhere on the order of like 10 to 15 embryos each time to be able to test, which is unusual for even young people. And every single one of those embryos was chromosomally abnormal both times. And if you think about it, look at all of those transfers that she could have gone through. And even when you're talking about things like if somebody would like to reduce their risk of having a baby with Down syndrome or trisomy 21, yes, we know the risks are higher in somebody who's 35 and above, but actually more Down syndrome babies are born to people who are less than 35 because they're more likely to get pregnant. So just because you're young does not mean you don't have a risk of that happening. And to some people that is important. To some people, it's not. It's okay. Each person and couple is an individual, but these are all things to kind of play into the decision-making process.
All right. Well, I think that is a very good discussion. Any last words that either of you would like to make? Carrie, any last words?
I think a lot of it is just talk to your RE, ask a ton of questions. This is not information that we pick up overnight. It's been evolving really rapidly in the past several years, but make sure you understand the benefits of the testing that you're getting. Because for some people, it's a great idea. And for some people, they're like, I don't care about the information. I don't want to. Like there's pros and cons to both of it. So just ask lots of questions so you understand what PGTA can tell you and other genetic testing can tell you and what it cannot tell you, because nothing is perfect. Nothing can tell you everything. So really try to understand what it is you can say and what it is you cannot say based on these results.
All right. Well, thanks for listening and tune in next week for more. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review in iTunes. We'd really love to hear from you.
You can also visit fertilitydocsuncensored.com to schedule an appointment with any of us or submit specific questions you have about infertility. All questions will be answered on the podcast anonymously for our Ask the Doc segment, so don't hold back. We love to answer your questions.
Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and we will talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.